short screencast is a very brief introduction to Haml, the HTML abstraction markup language, which we're going to use in our Rails apps to produce the HTML markup that is actually returned to the browser. We've got the Rotten Potatoes homepage open, and we're going to view source as we've done before, and we're going to compare the HTML markup with the Haml markup that's actually part of the application. Now we'll learn more about how to create these Haml files in the Ruby introduction chapter, but for now let's just take a look at how Haml is used to represent HTML in a much more concise manner. You can see that a Haml element beginning with % will produce the corresponding HTML element. So here's an all movies inside of an H1, and sure enough, here it is in our HTML markup. Now you might be wondering, where is the Haml that created all of this preamble stuff up here? As we'll learn in Chapter 3, there's a separate application template that is used to wrap every page. We're not going to take a look at that just now, so let's just focus on the page body, which is actually created by this Haml template. An interesting thing to notice is that the Haml version is much more concise than the HTML version. And in part, that's because Haml uses indentation to indicate element nesting. For example, we can see that this table element includes a t-head and a t-body element. Those, in turn, include other elements nested inside them. Now, in the HTML markup that's generated, although the indentation has been preserved for clarity, you can see that the table actually requires a closing tag. The t-head actually requires a closing tag. In other words, in HTML, every element has to be explicitly closed, whereas in Haml, indentation is used to indicate what the nesting is. This may not seem like a big deal, but given that nesting can go 4, 5, or 6 levels deep, it actually ends up saving a lot of clutter to do it this way. And if you've ever programmed in the Python language, this scheme might look familiar to you. Another useful feature about Haml is that on the same line as an element name, you can tell the element's ID, for example, #movies. Although it's not shown in this example, we could also have added a dot followed by a string to indicate the class of an element. So Haml's syntax for attaching ID information or class information to an element was deliberately chosen to look like CSS's notation. And indeed, a table whose ID is movies is exactly what we have in our HTML markup over here. The last feature of Haml that we're going to illustrate in this short screencast is that you can interpolate or embed the result of executing Ruby code into a Haml template. If you begin a line of markup with a hyphen, it means execute this Ruby code, but throw the output away. Now, in this case, the code just begins an iteration over all of the movies that are going to be shown in the table, so there isn't really any output to be produced anyhow. But a line of Haml whose first character is an equal sign means execute the Ruby code and place the output into the HTML itself. So for example, given this movie variable that is resulting from iterating over the collection of movies, as we'll learn about in Chapter 3, we're extracting its title, its rating, and so on, and because of the equal sign, those values are actually being substituted directly into the HTML markup. And we'll learn more in Chapter 3 about link to and some of the other code that you see here. Finally, one last thing to notice, again as we'll see in Chapter 3, in Ruby whenever we have a loop such as a do loop, we expect somewhere that there's going to be an end statement telling us where the end of the loop is. Haml dispenses with that because once again indentation is exclusively used to indicate the scope of a particular declaration or an HTML tag. So to summarize, Haml tags can either be a single line, as in the case of H1, or they can consist of multiple lines in which the first line is just the information about the tag, and subsequent lines which are indented tell us what are the contents of the tag. And if we begin a line with a hyphen, we can execute some Ruby code and throw the output away. We can begin a line with an equal sign to execute some Ruby code and substitute the output directly into the HTML template. Check out the Haml documentation referred to in the book text to get complete details about this concise and elegant markup language, which we're going to be using for all of our HTML generating needs.